The story begins with a boy who dedicated 7 years of his life to become a hunter. However, the results were disappointing. There were numerous reasons for his failure. The hunter's exam involved missions like hunting monsters assigned in vast dungeons. In the early stages, those with low levels couldn't defeat them. Later, those who leveled up and got good equipment would defeat the monsters, ending the exam. But for the protagonist, when he finally got his equipment, his stamina ran out, leading to a collapse during the exam. As he stared at his phone, the boy questioned if this was reality. Then a man approached, asking if he was taking a break. However, the protagonist claimed he had already killed all the monsters, but the man insisted he return to the beginning and turn in the loot. He asked if he wanted to join the fight against the boss. The young man thought it was a lie, as they only took those with a lot of money. Apologizing and saying he would do it, he noticed something as he was leaving. The group of adventurers was preparing to enter the portal, and a guy called out to him, mentioning that Jianwu had leveled up. The boy asked why he would become a high-ranking adventurer when he didn't even want to. Asking why the group only had low-ranking people, the man replied that the supervisor had issued an emergency order to the guild due to an A-rank dungeon, leaving the D-rank dungeon short on people. He mentioned Jianwu could level up if he beat the boss this time. The boy asked who the other two members were, since they'd need high-level hunters to kill the dungeon boss. The guy said they'd need 2 hunters of level 100 or higher among 10 people to defeat the boss. Jianwu then approached a random guy, asking if he tried to catch a circle miss before. It was the guy's first time, and he had no experience, just observing. He reassured the protagonist that even if he lacked experience, he trusted his sword. Checking the boy's status, Jianwu saw he was the grandson of Korea's leading medium-sized company's president at level 55. Even with a hunter over level 100, it might not be enough, so they hired a hunter who traveled through dungeons with money. The only remaining guild member was the level 205 supervisor, which should be more than enough. However, bosses weren't something they could handle alone, needing to deal with small mobs that appeared and constantly changed their attack targets. If their health fell to 30%, they'd explode in 3 minutes, meaning they had to defeat them in that time. The supervisor asked if they'd studied the boss, advising them to kill the random bosses and hit them with their force when they tried to explode. Jianwu immediately asked what to do if their damage wasn't enough. The man recommended they flee to the portal, but staying to fight, even if they died, might be better. If they had no more questions, they should advance immediately. However, the protagonist sighed, knowing there was no turning back. Shortly after, the boy mentioned his level was slightly higher than the others, asking if the protagonist had ever defeated a boss. The other guy asked if he didn't know, as Jianwu had killed a boss more than 3 times. Jiayong then suggested they stick together, as pooling their strength might be more than enough. Accepting the offer, the protagonist's friend said he looked forward to leveling up, suggesting they go out for drinks afterward. Meanwhile, Jianwu thought his friend's intention was to secure opportunities to enter high-level dungeons through that guy. Having connections with a rich person could easily get them into high-level dungeons, and so the 3 entered the dungeon portal. However, Jiayong gave a malicious smile, hinting at ulterior motives. Inside the dungeon, the boss immediately appeared, summoning his soldiers. The other group in battle mentioned there were over 50 of them, and they were higher level than usual. Pressured, Jiayong asked for help. However, the captain also needed assistance, telling them to defeat the smaller mobs and then join him. Jianwu mentions there were many skeletons, asking what they should do. However, his friend arrives to help, telling him to go defeat the boss while he stays behind. Jianwu didn't want to leave him there, as he might end up dying. His friend asks him to wait just a minute, suggesting they go help the supervisor. Then Jaeyoung calls the protagonist to go with him. The creature's eye starts glowing. Jianwu asks Jaeyoung to wait, as he'll finish it off in 30 seconds. Observing the creature, he realizes it's level 122 and only has 27% HP left. Advancing towards the monster, his captain asks why he arrived at that moment, ordering him to attack. Seeing his attacks weren't working, Jianwu suggests they leave, but his captain insists they can't leave before finishing off that creature. At that moment, a skeleton tries to attack the boy, but he dodges it. Knocking down the monster, the protagonist thinks it's madness because he almost died. A crowd of skeletons starts approaching the group, asking why all those monsters were coming towards them. The captain, seeing his comrades defeated on the ground, orders them to take care of them as he leaves the boss room. However, Jaeyoung is attacked by a skeleton, but the protagonist eliminates him instantly. While his captain leaves, he tells Jianwu to follow him as he'll protect them. However, that crowd of monsters had already surrounded the exit portal. Plus, there were only 19 seconds left for the dungeon boss to explode. While the boy flees, Jaeyoung apologizes for not defeating the boss, but Jianwu says they'll talk about it later. At that moment, there were only 5 seconds left for the boss to explode. However, when his group was almost crossing the portal, Jaeyoung kicks the protagonist, leaving him in the dungeon, where he instantly explodes. Then images from when Jianwu was a child begin to appear in his head, telling his mother that when he grew up, he would become a hunter because he wanted to earn a lot of money and help his brothers, besides marrying a very beautiful person. But with a frightened look, his parents ask why he was lying. Instantly, the protagonist wakes up. Observing his surroundings, he questions why he was still alive. Then a voice begins to call Jianwoo. His captain sees the items the boss dropped and says he was right about not being able to escape. Hearing Jaeyoung's voice, the boy remembers he pushed him. At that moment, the dungeon starts to collapse, and the captain orders them to take everything they can and then flee. However, unbeknownst to the group, the protagonist was still alive, screaming and asking for help from them. And then the dungeon collapses. Sometime later, Jianwoo was buried, wondering where everything had gone wrong, thinking he should never have entered that dungeon. But that didn't matter anymore because nothing would change, so he should just accept death. However, the boy didn't want to die yet. Viewing his status window, Jianwoo realizes he only had 5 health points left. Taking out his phone, he uses its flashlight among the rubble. Feeling a breeze, the protagonist sees a hole amidst all the destruction, managing to escape from there. However, when he looks around, he sees a giant corridor, wondering what it was because it looked very different from the boss room. Then a portal appears in front of him. The boy supposes that explosion had revealed a hidden dungeon. Approaching the portal, he realizes it was an S-rank dungeon. Remembering it was a dungeon with the highest difficulty among dungeons, even superior class heroes would hesitate to enter. Then the boy starts running, thinking he still didn't want to die. However, the ceiling starts to collapse, leaving the protagonist pressured, where he ended up having to enter the portal. Observing around him, Jianwoo sees several gravestones. Among the mist, an unknown figure appears. The boy gets scared, asking if that was a monster. But it wasn't, as it had a status window. Making Jianwoo glad, he thought that person had cleared that dungeon. Approaching the man, a light begins to emanate from him. Observing that guy, the protagonist asks what he was doing because he wasn't moving. Then the man starts screaming about the effort he had accumulated, leaving Jianwoo confused if that guy was really a person and not an NPC. However, NPCs didn't exist in real life, wondering if he had encountered one. Trying to approach the man several times, he always screamed the same thing until at one point that man got annoyed, asking Jianwoo to stop as he had tried to act like an NPC after so long but had been stuck in that repetition. Observing the protagonist, the man asks how a level 46 had ended up in that place, but for Jianwoo, it had just happened, questioning who he was. Then the guy says he was the manager of that place and somewhat an NPC. Jianwoo asks if he could say where the exit was, but the only way was by clearing the dungeon. But he shouldn't be discouraged because health levels meant nothing. Mentioning that place was S-ranked, and no matter his level, anyone could be killed because luck was the only thing that mattered in that dungeon. Not everyone could enter that place as they needed to meet some conditions, so it could be said that Jianwoo was already lucky, and who knew he might end up having the opportunity to get a secret item. But for the protagonist, that was impossible because he was level 46 and only had 5 health points. Then the man says his time was up, telling the protagonist to do his best and not give up. At that moment, the man disappears and a mission window appears with a mission where Jianwoo had to find a weapon. Looking up, the boy notices something, and then several objects start falling from the sky. Then a shadow appears before Jianwoo where a giant bull appears, throwing the protagonist away. Observing that bull, the boy realizes his status bar had a question mark, meaning it was at least 100 levels above him. Looking back, he sees several swords, noticing they were all legendary grade, wondering how he had managed to get such an item so easily. Then it would be much simpler to leave that dungeon and end it with just one blow. Striking the bull, however, caused no damage. But Jianwoo didn't have time to hesitate and needed to end it once and for all. Then at that moment, the bull wakes up, starting to follow the protagonist who dodges the bull's attack. Then that man was still there, saying that Jianwoo dodged very well. The boy mentions he was almost dying, asking if he wouldn't help him. Remembering that one of those swords could really defeat the bull, but the problem was knowing which one it was, throwing several at once to test while dodging attacks. At that moment, the bull tries to hit the protagonist from behind, grabbing a shield to defend himself. Then the system informs him that he had exhausted all his HP, so now he had the same resistance as a normal person. Looking to the side, he sees a shining sword. Seeing his abilities, Jianwoo wonders what he would do with those skills. And at that moment, the bull charges towards the boy. Then the protagonist uses the sword's ability, but the bull dodges. In that situation, Jianwoo's body was completely destroyed, asking if that would be his end. Looking at the sky, he sees a dagger stuck in the tree. Taking the dagger, the system informs him that it had no identified grade, and that he had completed the mission of finding the sword to defeat the bull. Determined, Jianwoo asks if the only thing he should do is defeat that creature, asking why he was hesitating. Then the bull uses an ability on the protagonist, determinedly shouting that he wanted to live, and jumping on the bull, striking a blow to its skull. Sometime later, the protagonist wakes up in a hospital. Realizing he had completed the mission, the boy is happy, thinking he had really defeated that creature. Then a girl enters his room, and that was the protagonist's sister. Becoming happy because Jianwoo had woken up going to warn his parents. His mother becomes angry, asking what he'd done to himself, and Jianwoo asks his father to stop his mother. However, the man asks why he should stop her, mentioning that if the situation was urgent, he should have left, asking why he had stayed. The protagonist thinks it was true, stating that Jae-yong was so results-oriented that when he tried to save him, he was betrayed, questioning what would have happened if he had ignored him. Then Ji-woo says the important thing was that he had returned safely, so they shouldn't worry because he would take care of himself. However, his sister suggests stopping being a hunter, and the protagonist asks why, because he had said he would take care of himself from now on. But his sister says it wasn't for that reason, and when he knew the reason, he shouldn't be shocked. The boy gets up, and when he looks in the mirror, he realizes he was level 1. Then sometime later, Ji-woo thinks he just wanted to have a normal life free from his poverty, mentioning that he had suffered for 7 years to get his level, asking why that had happened. They say he had been seen in front of the dungeon portal, however, he was level 1. That was completely inexplicable, so it must have happened after his battle with the bull. He even thought about entering the dungeon again to ask the man what had happened, but didn't know how to get back there, thinking it was very unfair because after clearing the dungeon, he hadn't been able to get any items besides losing all his levels. Looking at his pillow, Ji-woo wonders what he should do from now on. Then he crushes the mosquito because it was bothering him, mentioning that he had trained for 7 years to fight mosquitoes. But even though he had returned to level 1, there was no way he could win. Then the system informs him that the tutorial was activated, instructing him to defeat 10 creatures. Then his sister arrives asking what was going on. So Ji-woo mentions that he had leveled up and had done it by defeating just 1 mosquito. His sister gets close to the boy saying he wasn't sick, asking his mother to take him to the psychiatrist. The protagonist says it's true, but his sister says to face reality. And when he looks in the mirror, he realizes he's still at level 1. Leaving Ji-woo surprised because he was sure he had leveled up. Watching the system notification, he informs that debuffs appeared and his life was recovering, so the effect beginner dagger was activated and his level was reset to level 1. Seeing the name of the ability, the protagonist asks if that wasn't the weapon he had used against the bull, asking his sister where his dagger was. Then his sister mentions that the government had gone to investigate that weapon, leaving the boy desperate, asking where it was now. But his sister mentions that it was in the personal property locker. Instantly, Ji-woo starts running to get his dagger, remembering that according to what the dungeon man had said, that is a dagger of unknown class, a powerful weapon given only to the person who had completed the mission. Then someone knocks on his head, and at the same time, Jae-young appears saying that the protagonist was already fine. Ji-woo gets angry realizing that Jae-young was in that place. His sister asks what he was doing because it was that man who paid the hospital bills, but Jae-young mentions that the boy had entered that state because he had saved him, so he couldn't complain even if he did worse. The protagonist asks his family to leave because they needed to talk alone. His mother asks what he intended to do with that man, but Ji-woo says that she could stay calm. When everyone had left, the boy asks why Jae-young had done that. Jae-young mentions that he always did tests as hair, and the assignment of that day was the boss symbol. But when the boss is destroyed, a person had to stay in the room for the items to fall. Ji-woo questions if he had taken a person to death because of just a test, but Jae-young says that the succession was also a matter of life or death and should win even if he had to step on his brothers and sisters. But a poor person like him would understand nothing, and if Ji-woo spread rumors about what had happened in the dungeon, he would suffer the consequences. The protagonist mentions that he was thinking of overcoming all that if Jae-young offered him money in compensation, asking what would happen if he refused. Jae-young says that they would enter into conflict, asking if that would be good for him, mentioning that his sister was very beautiful. Then his friend arrived happy because he was really alive. Jae-young said he would like to continue the conversation, but he didn't want to disturb the meeting with his friend. While his friend hugged the protagonist, he asked the man to move away because it was very odd the guy asked if it wasn't very rude because he had even taken his gun for him. Watching the dagger, Ji-woo thinks it really was the dagger he had taken in the dungeon. Then his friend asked why the protagonist wanted so much a low-class dagger, and the boy asked if the investigations had been concluded. He said that dagger had no skills. Watching the dagger, the protagonist thought it was impossible. Then time passed, and Ji-woo was still looking at that dagger. Seeing the skills of the dagger, realizes that he had a skill that when his life is low, he becomes invincible for 10 seconds regardless of what level is your enemy. Ji-woo thinks it is really strong, mentioning that only he could see the information of the dagger, remembering that he had really leveled up when he defeated the boss. However, the downside was that he had returned to level 1, but that wasn't a problem because it was just visual. However, Ji-woo thought he would encounter problems if he continued with that dagger, suggesting selling it. But the system informs that only the original bearer could use it. In other words, if he sold it, he would break the contract and would have to die, mentioning that he couldn't die just to sell it. So the only thing he could do was walk alone through the dungeons, because if used correctly, he could easily clear a rank B dungeon, but he didn't know if that would be good in the long run. And if they knew about his items, they could try to kill him to get them for themselves. So he definitely had to do it alone, mentioning that he would do the tutorial first. Then the boy starts walking around the room defeating mosquitoes. And when he finishes the tutorial, the system informs that there was a reward, asking if the protagonist wanted to confirm it. However, Ji-woo didn't know how to redeem the reward, but instantly a giant chest starts falling on him. Watching the chest, Jianwoo wonders if it was made of gold, asking if that wouldn't make him rich without entering the dungeons. However, inside the chest was only an old piece of clothing, leaving the protagonist furious, throwing the clothes away. But at the same moment, a person opens the door where that clothes end up hitting the man. Jianwoo realizes that those men were from the hunter's agency, thinking if he had done something wrong. Then the man mentions that they had said he looked mentally disturbed, so had gone to check, saying his name was Jung Si-hoon and was a public security team leader, asking if the protagonist had raised his level, asking for your assistant to measure it. However, your level remained the same. The man asks if the protagonist really thought he had raised his level. However, the boy says he wasn't sure. However, the man asks what he meant, because if he had raised his level, the information should have appeared in the status window. Jianwoo mentions that it had appeared but had disappeared, and the guy says that was strange, asking the boy to check your status window. Jianwoo, looking at the window, thinks he really leveled up. Then the man asks if his level really had increased. The protagonist says he didn't. The guy asks why he had hesitated to speak, but the boy mentions that he wanted to get his shirt back. Then the man asks if he didn't want to throw it away, but he says that could be a waste. Then his assistant whispers, saying that he would call a doctor who has special abilities, because it was hard to believe in the boy. The man mentions that he would let the protagonist go, but if eventually receives special abilities, should contact. Also that if used powers without permission would end up being punished. Shortly after both left, Jianwoo wears the shirt. Then the system informs that he would receive an update as a reward, and if he wanted to use, should put the stone on the item. Using the stone in the shirt, it begins to shine. The system informs that he had received an ability that made him invisible, leaving the boy surprised because that ability was very useful, questioning how much he could sell. Then the boy takes off his pants to test the ability. Observing the mirror, Jianwoo realizes that his reflection wasn't there, mentioning that it was very scary holding his clothes. The protagonist realizes that everything he touched became invisible. Then the system informs that his magical power had run out, so the skill would be disabled. However, when the skill disable, your sister enters the room, seeing the protagonist in that embarrassing situation. Sometime later, a hooded man walked through the streets, and that was the protagonist walking in an abandoned building. Then a mission appears for him to defeat 5 bosses. The boy mentions that things got serious because now they weren't just mosquitoes. Seeing the building, Jianwoo uses his skill to go unnoticed by the guards. Looking up, he realizes the ability sensor, quickly disabling your skill to pass, and then activates again. Seeing that many people in the dungeons, the boy mentions that he had more people than normal. Then the system informs that he had already used 50% of his power, and his skill would disable in 40 seconds. While running to hide, Jianwoo saw the news saying that the Class B dungeon cleaning had failed, asking for help from the adventurers. At the same time, a creature inside the building appears, and a giant lizard lunges at the boy, crushing the protagonist to the ground. With his health completely depleted, the system informs that his ability condition was fulfilled. Grabbing his dagger, the boy is pleased as he only needed a word to equip it. While the lizard attacked, Jianwoo thought it was incredible because he truly became invincible, defeating the lizard with just one blow. Then the system informs that he had defeated the lizard and had increased his level. The protagonist thinks that's why his ability had that name, because it lived up to its name. Next, a group of adventurers approach, questioning what the light was. Jianwoo starts running, thinking he should hide quickly, but instantly another lizard appears. However, with only 1 second left before his ability would deactivate, Jianwoo annihilates the lizard. The group of adventurers sees the scene and are surprised as he defeated the lizard with just one blow. However, they are confused, observing that he was only level 1. Then the protagonist starts running. Immediately, more lizards appear, starting to attack the adventurers. However, the captain was still after the protagonist, mentioning that they were very persistent. But other adventurers appear, confused by the boy's level. Next, Jianwoo uses his ability to pass through the group. The group of adventurers asks why that man was following the boy. Then the guy mentions that the protagonist had defeated a lizard even though he was level 1, which meant he probably had a mythical item, so if they defeated him, they could take the items. Jianwoo, away from the men, thinks he will enter other dungeons, but protagonist steps on a glass, catching the attention of the adventurers, who use an attack on the boy, who manages to dodge. Then the system informs that his ability would deactivate, where it ends up exposed to the group, who start attacking Jianwoo again, who dodge all attacks. Opening the system window, the boy asks to improve his attribute points, getting a new skill. Seeing a dungeon in front of him, the protagonist uses his ability to enter the portal, confusing the group of adventurers. The men watching the portal realize that this was not a party dungeon, so if they entered, they would probably enter a dungeon. However, the other guy mentions that if they cleaned the dungeon, the portal would open. In addition to that, dungeon was only rank C, that is, they just needed to wait for the boy to die, and when the portal opened, they would take his items. But the other man says the protagonist had defeated a lizard alone, wondering if that plan would really work. But of course, it would be impossible to clean the dungeon alone, mentioning that he has already been there. Meanwhile, Jianwoo was falling into a cliff, so the system informs that he had entered a rank C dungeon. Falling to the ground, the boy says that dungeon looked like rankings, mentioning that he would need a parachute next time. Looking around, he realizes that dungeon was completely closed besides the fact that there were no monsters. Then the system alerts that the mission would start in 10 seconds, asking the boy to prepare. Your goal was to survive by defeating the monsters within the mission time. Next, a level 90 slime appears on top of the dungeon. The protagonist is pleased because the slime's level wasn't invisible. But another slime appears, and soon after a crowd appears, leaving Jianwu surprised by that amount of monsters, who start descending to attack the protagonist. Next, Jianwu advances on the slimes. Hitting the boy, he thinks those attacks hurt more than normal, but it didn't matter because if he defeated the slimes, his life would recover. Cutting the slime in half, however, it divides into two, and at the same moment starts swallowing Jianwu, who uses his dagger to defeat the slime but still had several of them, attacking the boy together. While his energy ran out, the protagonist thinks he should at least defeat a level 45 slime. Among the slimes, Jianwu realizes a level 45 slime advancing on him. However, the boy is knocked out and the system informs that he had exhausted his health. Outside the portal, the man explains what they should do to complete that portal, mentioning that Jianwu would never finish that dungeon. However, it had been 5 minutes since the boy entered, assuming the protagonist had another item to help him clean the dungeon. But if so much time had passed, he must have caused a dungeon break, stating that they would wait because Jianwu could be using his ability to hide besides the portal would open soon. Meanwhile, the boy was still battling against the slimes, gradually increasing his level. Defeating all the monsters, the protagonist thinks it's amazing. Looking at his status window, he realizes it's only been 9 minutes since he entered the dungeon and he's already gained 1,500 points. It's as if he gained 300 levels, which would normally take years, but he did it in the blink of an eye. The system informs that the boss is about to appear. Jianwu thinks it's expected since the boss is the main thing in the dungeon, but with the item he has, he won't worry because he can defeat the boss with his ability. Mentioning he never thought he'd have such power one day. Remembering the people who were chasing him, he wonders if those adventurers are still outside. At that moment, the system informs that the boss is about to appear. The protagonist asks what kind of creature it would be. Looking up, something flies over his head, and it's a huge dragon. Jianwu, observing that creature, becomes worried, wondering if his dagger will really be enough for a monster like that. Outside the dungeon, the guy says no matter how long they wait, the protagonist won't come out. However, the man says if they didn't like it, they could just leave, leaving the group dissatisfied because after following him, he was sending them away. Asserting they will leave, however, they would like compensation, asking if the man thought they would cooperate with the stranger for free. Then the guy who examined the protagonist arrives, asking if anyone had entered that dungeon. Meanwhile, Jianwu battles against the dragon, telling it to stop breathing fire on him, asking how that dragon hasn't landed yet. Then the protagonist has an idea and grabs one of the weapons on the ground, using his ability to throw the spear at the dragon. However, it misses by a long shot. While the dragon attacks, Jianwu opens his status window saying he needs strength. Leveling up all his strength attributes, the boy grabs a shiny sword. Throwing it again at the dragon, however, had no effect. But the protagonist is pleased as he at least hit, mentioning that it would increase his life and his statistics. Grabbing his spear again, he throws it at the dragon, but this time causing effect. Jianwu says with a weapon like that he would surely have a chance, throwing several at once in the dragon, causing a sequence of damage to it, leaving the protagonist dissatisfied because that monster had a lot of life. And then the dragon starts to land, attacking the boy directly. The system informs that he had taken a lot of damage and only had half health. Jianwu is surprised because the dragon had just taken half his life with just one attack. Watching the dragon, he realizes its attack pattern had changed, using his dagger to attack. However, it wasn't enough, causing the boy to take more damage. Defeated on the ground, Jianwu thinks he had failed. Then the system informs that the condition had been met and he could use his invincibility. Determined, the protagonist states he still had a chance, advancing on the dragon. Then the system warns he had just received a new ability, decapitating the dragon in less than a second. Then the system informs that Jianwu had defeated the dragon and had increased his level. Shortly after, the guy who examined the protagonist enters the dungeon. Looking up, the guy says that was the place where that level 1 had entered. Then his assistant asks if they weren't wasting time in that place, because that was a rank C dungeon and even being level 1 he could clean it. Besides, when Jianwu was examined, he had no signs of having any incredible ability. But for the man, if that level 1 had any item that could be possible. The guy asks what he meant, and the man mentions that 15 years was empty. The protagonist's friend mentions there was no boss, so there must have been some mistake. Jae-young says they can't do anything, and the only thing they could do was leave the dungeon and restart. Meanwhile, Jiang-woo was right behind them, and the system informs that the boy had defeated the boss, leveling up his stats. Sometime later, Jiang-woo had already returned home. His mother asks the boy if he had eaten something. Then she mentions she had gone to look for a job besides having already eaten. Inside his room, Jiang-woo says it was a complete victory. Seeing his friend's message on the phone, he says he did the dungeon 3 times, and in the 3 times, no boss appeared. The protagonist says Jae-young must be furious because he had repeated 3 times in vain. Seeing the progress of his mission, the boy plans to complete the dungeon 1 more time. However, there would always be another chance, suggesting to check the price of the items he had received. Looking at the computer, Jian was surprised, questioning why that was on the main list. Because one of the news items was talking about the protagonist when he was on missions and the group of adventurers had found him. At that moment, his mother enters the room, handing him money, but Jian says he's fine. However, his mother mentions that he must be tired from working at night, asking him to go eat something. Then the boy thinks he can't give up because he wants to see his family happy. Switching back to Jae-young, who was furious, wondering who was defeating the bosses in his place. His assistant asks if he should ask for the guild president's support, but Jae-young says they couldn't ask just because of that. Then someone knocks on the boy's door. It was the protagonist's friend, saying he knew someone who wanted to join the hunt and came to recommend him. Because he had posted about yesterday's event in the community and someone had shown interest, leaving Jae-young curious, asking who it was. Then the boy is surprised when he hears it was a level 458, asking why such a high level would want to join them. Next, Kim mentions that person had set some conditions. Explaining to Jae-young, the boy asks to proceed. Back to the protagonist, who was observing a group of adventurers, realizing the dungeon was starting. Watching the dungeon's statistics, he feels relieved because security was very tight, and if he placed a tracking stone on the portal, he could open it from a distance. Then Jae-young's group enters the dungeon. Jian-woo is pensive if he should enter at that moment. Then the system informs about a rank D dungeon, asking if he wants to enter. So the protagonist enters the dungeon. From the top of the dungeon, Jian-woo watches the battle, and when he falls to the ground, he uses his ability to go to the boss room. Looking up from the mountain, the boy mentions Jae-young had chosen a more difficult dungeon because he was afraid the boss would be stolen, but that wouldn't work where he starts climbing the mountain. In front of the boss's door, Jian-woo says he just needs to defeat the boss now. And when he opens the door, he notices a 3-headed dog with an undetermined level. Getting excited because if he had met such a monster a month ago, he would certainly have been afraid, but now it's different. Approaching the monster, the boy falls into a trap, asking what it was. Then an unknown figure appears, saying the community posts were right because he was level 1. Observing that person, Jian-woo realizes he was level 458. Then the guy asks how he got that dagger. However, the protagonist says he doesn't know what he's talking about. Laughing, the guy says he really wouldn't tell, and given his stats, he must have gotten that dagger recently, asking the boy to hand over that dagger. But the boy mentions that it was a limited item, and even if he took it, he couldn't use it, asserting that if he could get rid of that item, he would surely sell it, but the man doesn't believe it. Then Jian-woo hands the dagger to him, asking him to check for himself. Observing the dagger, the man asks if he should really kill him, leaving Jian-woo confused, advancing towards the protagonist. But the boy was prepared, taking his weapon back, defending the guy's attack. However, he was pressed, thinking he was being surpassed in strength, opening the system trying to increase his stats. But the man doesn't let him, attacking the boy. Then Jian-woo uses his ability to become invisible, but the guy knew where he was, asking where he would go, striking a blow to the protagonist's chest. At the same time, the system informs that the conditions were met, and he could use his ability. Jian-woo says he didn't want to harm anyone but would be forced to do so using his invincible ability. However, the guy starts to leave, leaving the protagonist. Then the man mentions he knew what that ability was. Then Jian-woo throws his dagger, but he misses his target. The system informs that there were a few seconds left for his ability to end. Besides, the boss was still alive. Immediately afterwards, Jian-woo advances towards the monster, dealing a blow to it. The system informs that he had defeated the boss and had leveled up. In addition, he had completed the mission of defeating 5 bosses. Then several colorful spheres begin to fall from the sky. Jian-woo picks up some of them, and he starts to enter the portal, but the armor guy notices him, advancing on him and immobilizing the protagonist. Then the boy mentions that he had just distributed his stats, so now he could see his movements, kicking the guy's head, and when his helmet falls, it was actually a woman all this time, leaving Jian-woo embarrassed because she was really beautiful. The girl asks why he was staring, warning that you would die. Starting to attack again, Jian-woo is surprised, but he realizes he was just taking hits. Then the boy says he had to go to the bathroom. Leaving, the protagonist smiles, saying they would meet again soon. However, when he tries to cross the portal, he can't. Then the system informs that he couldn't pass because that dungeon used a sealed stone, asking the boy to break it or wait 30 minutes. At the same moment, a voice from behind says his guess was right. Looking back, Jian-woo notices Jae-young's group. The protagonist is surprised because he recognized him, so there was no need to disguise himself. Kim is surprised, asking why his friend was in that place, but Jiwoo says he'll explain later. Then the girl says she had told Jaeyoung not to enter the boss room until they caught the boy. Then Jaeyoung orders the adventurers to attack, saying she was conspiring. When they were completely surrounded, Jaeyoung mentions that a level 1 person couldn't simply defeat the boss and escape, meaning someone had to help him, wasn't it? Treasure hunter Han Cyan. The girl hesitates because she would have to join a regatta terrorist, leaving the protagonist pissed off. Then the girl starts taking off her armor, mentioning they weren't together. But since they didn't believe her, she would kill them. Jianwoo asks, since they had reached that situation, couldn't they make an alliance? However, the girl refuses because she would prefer to die than hand over her dagger. So the protagonist opens the system window, affirming he would show her a bit of magic, taking several stones from the inventory and absorbing them. Shortly after, the system informs that a hidden mission had been generated, ordering Jianwoo to advance to the boss room. And when the condition was met, the system notifies that a condition of the hidden mission had been met, asking if the boy would like to continue, where Jianwoo ends up accepting. And at the same moment, the boss room door closes, putting everyone in the room on alert. Their mission was to release the sealed specters, killing the mission donor or the summoned monsters. Then the mountain starts to crack. Watching those creatures rising from the underground, Jaeyoung mentions those were zombies. Seeing that situation, Jianwoo realizes all the skeletons had a question mark on their level, and to make matters worse, the system allowed the protagonist to use his invincibility ability only once. Then one of the adventurers tries to attack the boy, but his friend helps him, telling the protagonist to run. However, Kim still feels pressured, where he ends up being knocked down. The man mentions he was trying to protect someone he knew, kicking the protagonist's friend, but at the same moment spits on the man, mentioning he was just high-level trash. Returning to Jianwoo, the system warns that there were no more points to upgrade his attributes, using his ability to help his friend, and apologizing for taking so long to improve his attributes. But when the guy was about to attack the boy, he uses a new ability, realizing that man's attacks were extremely slow, where in a matter of moments slices the man, mentioning that his weapon wasn't just beautiful but also very powerful. Kim tries to ask the boy where all that power came from, but Jianwoo asks him to just drink the potion and rest because after everything was over, he would explain everything. However, the adventurers saw his battle against the man, wondering how he had done all that even though he was level 1. But Jaeyoung affirms not to be afraid because he was still just level 1, leaving the protagonist nervous, telling them to come at him. Going for the skeletons, Jianwoo realizes they all had a question mark on their level, so those skeletons start attacking Jaeyoung's group while telling the adventurers not to die. Those close to the protagonist are attacked one by one, rising his level little by little, thinking his weapon was really powerful. Right after that, a giant skeleton appears in front of Kim when he was taking a potion, but in a matter of seconds, Jianwoo eliminates him. His friend thanks him, but the protagonist asks why he was thanking him, saying to just relax. The adventurers watching Jianwoo's skills are surprised because that guy kept defeating monsters and still remained level 1. Trying to hear what the men were saying, Jianwoo wonders what they were talking about. Then the girl grabs a shiny sword, starting to defeat the skeletons one by one even without her armor. Seeing the girl, Jianwoo thinks her moves were amazing. And at that moment, a skeleton appears behind her, where the protagonist uses his ability to defeat the monster, apologizing because his hand had just slipped. But the girl remains quiet and leaves, leaving the protagonist sad because she hadn't even thanked him. Soon after, the girl leaps, defeating a monster that was behind Jianwoo, mentioning that her hand had slipped too. Watching the adventurers, Jianwoo asks them to come at him. The girl says they were already overwhelmed with monsters, questioning why he had provoked them, but the boy says it was just to boost morale. Then Kim says he would also help, leaving Jianwoo happy because he had already recovered from his injuries. However, when the adventurers advance towards the boy, the ground starts to break and a crater begins to open. The system informs that the first mission had been completed, and now the second mission was beginning, asking Jianwoo to go to a safe area until the time limit. The adventurers are surprised because the ground is dividing, and at that moment, one of them falls into the crater. Jianwoo ponders because if they fell, they would certainly die. Then Kim calls him, saying that place was safe, but there was a giant crater between them. Checking his inventory, the protagonist says he had no choice, mentioning that even if he failed, he could go back 10 seconds in time. However, when he looks back, Jaeyoung is attacking him, saying all of that was the protagonist's fault, and when the boy attacks him, Jianwoo's items start falling. This makes the protagonist nervous, and he kicks Jaeyoung, who also kicks him, and they both start falling. Then Jianwoo uses his necklace to go back in time, but it doesn't work because it wasn't enough. However, the girl arrives, asking Jianwoo to hold her hand. Immediately, the protagonist thanks her for saving him, but she mentions she did it just to retrieve her dagger. Kim says he also saved him, but the boy only had eyes for the person in front of him. And when they look to the side, Jaeyoung is still alive. The adventurers are surprised because Jaeyoung had actually managed to return. Seeing the boy, Kim is also surprised because he had only climbed with the sword. At that moment, the ground starts to collapse. Jaeyoung mentions he had managed to find the boss token that Jianwoo had stolen, so he would need that to take over his company, showing Jianwoo that he had indeed succeeded. But something crushes his head. The boy is surprised when he sees what was right above. It was a giant skeleton. Then the system informs that the final hidden mission had begun, ordering to defeat that monster. The adventurers are desperate trying to escape through the portal. However, they couldn't because they needed to defeat the boss first. Him, watching that creature, asks how they could defeat that monster. Shortly after, that creature summons its mini soldiers, or several dark knights, who begin to massacre the adventurers in front of them. Jianwoo, watching that massacre, ends up paralyzed. Kim is nervous because they had been massacred with just one blow. And then the knights notice the protagonist's group advancing towards them. The girl asks if Jianwoo hadn't used his ability because it had been sealed during the fight. The protagonist affirms, saying that ability had a time limit. But the girl didn't want to hear that, telling him to finish off the knights while he asks if he couldn't at least do it as an incentive. She asks why, because if he died, she would simply take the dagger and finish it alone. So Jianwoo starts advancing towards the knights, taking several attacks in a row. Using his ability, the boy realizes there was a knight behind him, affirming he could see everything. However, the soldier ends up dodging. The system warns that Jianwoo was running out of energy, so he should rest. However, the boy had to keep going. Then the system informs that the condition had been met, so he could use his ability. Using his skill, the boy advances, eliminating the knights with just one blow. With only 3 seconds left for his ability to end, he jumps onto the boss, hitting him squarely in the skull. Then the system informs that he had defeated the boss, leveling up. However, Kim asks Jianwoo to be careful. But it was already too late because the protagonist ends up being stabbed in the back. Looking to the side, Jianwoo is confused, not knowing who had done that to him. It was Jaeyoung, who was still alive, saying he would kill him. Returning to when Jaeyoung was falling into the crater, he wonders if he would die that way, affirming that everything had gone wrong because of Jianwoo. And at that moment, a voice asks if the boy desired revenge. A red aura begins to approach the boy, asking him to give his life and it would help him. Then a red system appears, asking Jaeyoung if he wanted to accept that contract. With a wicked smile, the boy accepts, stating that giving up being human was extremely easy. Returning to the present, the system notifies that a new mission would begin, asking Jianwoo to defeat Jaeyoung, who had thrown his life away to become a monster. The protagonist is surprised that a person could turn into a monster. Then Kim advances towards Jaeyoung, asking Jianwoo to get out of there. However, with just one punch, his friend falls to the ground, zeroing his life bar. The girl asks Jianwoo to just watch while she heals herself, and when she attacks the monster, it has no effect. With just one blow, the girl is thrown far away, also zeroing her life points. In front of her, Jaeyoung was about to finish her off, but Jianwoo uses his ability to reach the girl, saying he was foolish for risking his life for her. Jianwoo mentions that caring for someone who saved him was also stupid. Shortly after, Jaeyoung approaches the two. Then the boy says that if he died, the girl could just take his dagger and make a contract, but she says she must win and stay alive. Jianwoo, with low health and abilities, mentions that if he took just one attack, it could be fatal, so he must find a weak point and end it by advancing on Jaeyoung. But when he attacks, the boy ends up defending himself, leaving Jianwoo surprised because that speed was like fighting a machine. Taking a knee directly, he then almost takes another attack but defends himself by stepping back. However, a light begins to emerge beside him, receiving a magic attack. The system informs that his HP had dropped to 0, so all his stats would disappear. Jianwoo questions if this was like an invitation to hell because everything had gone wrong, so maybe he should give up being a hunter. However, the boy couldn't. At that moment, Jaeyoung appears, leaving the protagonist confused if it was an illusion, attacking his sword that ends up breaking. Jaeyoung tries to attack the boy, but he dodges, piercing his body. The system informs that he had defeated Jaeyoung, so the mission was over. Exhausted, the protagonist falls to the ground, and at the same time, it starts raining. The battle had already ended, and consequently, countless lives had been taken for a stupid reason. And then a man asks where he thought he was already dead. The other guy asks if there was something wrong or if there were still monsters. So that was the protagonist supposedly in someone else's body, saying he just thought there were too many dead people. Jianwoo was surprised, asking if he was possessed by that person, continuing to say that if everyone had a skill, it could have avoided that massacre, mentioning that it was unfair because only people like them could receive runes. But the man asks him to stop saying that, and instead of offering meaningless comfort, kill the monsters that harm people or obtain the original stone that will restore the world to its former state. The first human, Han Seojin. And then the protagonist wakes up saying it was just a dream. Seeing that house, he mentions that everything was very luxurious, saying he didn't know a rich person, asking where he was. Opening a door, the boy says it was amazing. Looking to the side, he observes a different door, asking what was inside that room. And when he touches the door, the system warns that the trap had been activated, where Jianwoo ends up being electrocuted. The system informs that he was temporarily paralyzed because he received a powerful electric shock. Then the girl appears, saying that of all those rooms, that one had a trap, making Jianwoo furious because she couldn't have at least warned him. Then a man appears, saying the boy was interesting. Jianwoo, watching that man, realizes he was level 871. Seeing that guy's appearance, the protagonist remembers he was the man from his dream. Sometime later, the three were talking, and the boy asks if he was saying that the guild leader of Manga had taken care of that matter. Jianwoo thinks that guild was one of the main ones and was supporting a treasure hunter, saying that was suspicious. Then Jianwoo asks how his friend was, and the man says he wasn't in danger and was recovering in the hospital. The protagonist asks why that man helped him. Answering, the boy takes his dagger, saying it was because of that. Mentioning that the girl had said that if he could sell the dagger, he would do it. Asking why he would do that, because with that dagger, he could become the greatest hunter in the world or even a hero. However, the boy was not interested in that. Mentioning that he had lived in poverty all his life, so it was better to live in a beautiful house with his family and enjoy life. So the man asks to make a deal about that dagger, but Jianwoo asks how, because only he could use. Then the man mentions that it was possible to use it in the Lost Land, leaving Jianwoo confused. The Lost Land is a place near the northern zone of Korea, a world taken over by monsters due to dimensional rifts. The protagonist mentions that even heroes died in that place, questioning if it was really safe. The man affirms, saying he would find a safe way to approach it. At that moment, Cyan offers 100 billion to buy the dagger, leaving the protagonist surprised by the amount of money, asking why she was so interested in it, as any night-level hunter could have such a mythical item. But the man says he couldn't reveal the reason. However, Cyan says she will tell him, but he would have to deal with the consequences afterward, mentioning that the dagger belonged to her brother, the first cataclysm hunter named Han Seongjun. Shortly after, Jianwoo remembers that was the name of the guy from his dream, saying it was the first time he heard about a first cataclysm hunter. Then the man replies that this information was controlled, and trying to learn more about it could not only put him at risk, but also his own family. Management Bureau, the highest authority in the country. Next, Jianwoo asks if he could at least see a photo, wanting to know what the previous owner of his dagger looked like. The man responds that he has a photo, but would need Cyan's permission. But the girl agrees readily, showing the photo to the protagonist. The boy thanks her and asks what would happen if he decided not to hand over the dagger. Then the man pulls out another dagger, leaving Jianwoo surprised, saying he didn't want to get involved in that problem, so he would hand over the dagger. The guy says Jianwoo made a wise choice, mentioning he had prepared an advance contract. Examining the contract, the protagonist thinks it over, affirming it was incredible, but Cyan says it was necessary to protect the dagger. He should have realized that the Management Bureau hunter was desperate to find his brother's items, and if they found out Jianwoo was the owner, they would arrest him regardless of the contract. In short, you should wait until the dagger was transferred to her. The boy gets nervous, questioning what rule number 4 meant, because if he died, the advance payment would be recovered. Starting to argue, the girl mentions it was because she didn't trust him, asking if he thought she was doing it for money. However, the man says he had a solution for that. But they continued arguing nonetheless, making him angry. Breaking the table in half, the man asks them to listen to him, saying a marriage would be the best option, because Cyan gains the surveillance she wants and Jianwoo receives his money. With a strange look, Jianwoo thinks that marrying a beauty like her could rival even the stars, saying he wasn't thrilled, but under the circumstances, they didn't have much choice. So the man says he made a wise choice, because when Jianwoo said he had defeated Jiayong, he noticed the girl was quite moved. Listening to what they were saying, Cyan gets angry, pointing the sword at the two. Sometime later, the two were signing the contract, leaving the girl surprised because Jianwoo's stats were lower than hers, asking how he had defeated Jiayong since he said he had no skills, but the boy didn't know. Saying it was as he had said before, a thread appeared before his eyes, then he was drawn to it. The girl mentioned she had never heard of anything like that, but had something bigger to deal with, because when they defeated the boss, the drop items simply didn't appear. Mentioning they had no choice but to return to that dungeon, Jianwoo asks if that wouldn't be dangerous because the Management Bureau hunter could be investigating. Then Cyan asks why he was following her, leaving Jianwoo confused if he wasn't, saying the protagonist would stay in the room cleaning, and saying if he didn't want the payment, it could end up delaying, but at that moment, Jianwoo grabs a vacuum cleaner, saying he wanted to try it. When the girl leaves, the boy says it was very boring. Returning to Cyan, the girl asks what it would be like. Although they had signed the contract, he might not cooperate. But the guy asks her not to worry because they would just wait and see. Jianwoo, watching television, notices the news reporting that 20 hunters had disappeared in a D-rank dungeon, and the only survivor had been the hunter named Kim Min-suk, who was in critical condition, still unconscious. The protagonist is surprised to see that was his friend. Sometime later at night, Jianwoo calls Cyan, but she was out of signal, leaving the protagonist nervous because it had already been 3 hours, wondering if they were still in the dungeon. Because he couldn't wait forever, so perhaps he should check if Kim was okay, and then return. Watching the journalists arguing with the guards, Jianwoo hides. Hearing the name of one of the guys who had examined him, the boy thinks it would be bad if he encountered them again. Besides, it was only a matter of time until the disadvantages of a beginner were revealed. But he couldn't simply leave Kim. Soon after, Saya informs that she was in front of Kim's hospital and would sneak in to check on his condition. So Jianwoo uses his ability, thinking he should be careful not to get caught. Observing the guards, the boy passes unnoticed with his skill, and the system informs that he had a total of 8 minutes until his ability deactivated. Listening to what the men were saying, they mentioned that when they went to check on Kim, he was missing. The man asked why his boss was obsessed with that guide, but he says it was confidential, asking not to discuss it and to check the VIP floor. Then Jianwoo thinks it would be a good idea to use the reporters to get past security, starting to follow the man. But sometime later, one of the guards bumps into a guy saying that area was not accessible to the public. The man says he just wanted to check on Kim's condition, but still the guy blocks him because he couldn't enter. Then Jianwoo goes unnoticed while the guards remove the reporter from that place. Seeing that place, the boy mentions that compared to the other, there wasn't much security there because there wasn't even a nurse. Shortly after, the system informs that the protagonist had only 5 minutes until his ability deactivated. So Jianwoo starts running, searching for where Kim was. Observing a door, the boy questions if that glow on the door was like the trap at Cyan's house. At that moment, someone discovers where the boy was. It was Kim, asking Jianwoo to follow him. Observing the doorknob, the system informs that it had found a trap. Entering a room, Kim says that was his prison, leaving the protagonist confused, questioning who had set up that trap. Then Kim replies, saying it was Jung Si-hoon. He had installed it because he believed that the assassins who killed Jae-young might come back. So Jianwoo asks if they thought it was an assassination. Kim affirms because he had pretended not to remember anything, but they insisted it was an assassination because they had used tracking spells in the dungeon, asking if his energy wouldn't run out if he kept using his ability, mentioning there was no one there. Deactivating his ability, Jianwoo asks how Kim knew he was coming. His friend says he was looking out the window, thinking he would come because of that item, showing a purple sphere, mentioning it had fallen after Jaeon's death, asking if that wasn't important. Jianwoo remembers that was the reward Cyan had mentioned. Thanking him, he asked if he needed to hide in that place, but that was the only safe way. Taking the sphere, the system informs that it was a memory orb. An orb containing the memories of the first hunter, asking to place it in the dungeon portal with a time limit of 10 hours, and if the limit exceeded, the reward would disappear. Kim, observing that countdown, asks what those numbers were, but the boy asks how he would know. At that moment, someone approaches and Kim asks Jianwoo to hide, using his invisibility ability. Then Jung enters the room, asking why Kim had moved to the next room. But he mentions he had gotten confused when ordering some drinks for the agents because the hospital rooms looked the same. Jung asks if he wasn't expecting someone, but he says no. However, there was a floating orb beside him, questioning what it was, drawing his sword to attack it. Cutting to the reporters outside, their boss asks if they had found Kim, but the guy says the agents had prevented him from entering the VIP area. At that moment, the hospital window breaks, where something falls onto a car. Observing that, the reporters question if that was a monster, and when they look, it was just a purple orb. Then Jung descends from the hospital, advancing towards that orb. In the midst of that confusion, the guy tells him and his friend to also follow, but when he looks to the side, he was no longer there, because he was already inside the car, asking what he was doing, asking him to get in. Inside the car, the two spot Jung chasing after the protagonist, preparing his camera to take a picture. Seeing that photograph, the guy wonders what that orb was because it was very fast. Then Jianwoo starts to evade Jung. The reporter accelerates, saying he wouldn't lose him. Realizing the orb was in an alley, the guy says that was his chance, trying to run over the protagonist. And at the same time, Jung charges at the orb, but the boy phases through the wall. In the midst of the explosion, the van flips over. The reporter asks if his boss was still alive. Then his boss asks how the camera was, confirming it was fine. Seeing that portal in front of them, they wonder where Jung had gone, since he had destroyed their van and escaped. However, the reporter mentions that there was a hunter holding the orb in the photo, besides the fact that he was level 1. Inside the portal, Jianwoo waits for Jung to appear. Then the system informs that entry into the portal was successful. Looking around, Jianwoo realizes he was in the sky. An unknown figure asks if the protagonist had arrived. And that was the guy from the beginning saying that Jianwoo had planned to collect items together, mentioning that human greed truly had no end. Seeing the boy, the guy asks why he was so surprised, but Jianwoo questions if that wasn't shameful. However, the man says that was a beach, so they should enjoy it, asking if he didn't like it because he even brought a reward, asking if he should leave. Seeing that guy, Jianwoo mentions he looked a lot like Songjun, asking the man his name, but he says he didn't have one, stating he was the manager so Jianwoo could call him whatever he liked. And with that, his reward was complete, asking the protagonist to leave, mentioning that his reward was to ask him a question, leaving Jianwoo furious because that was nothing, calling him a thief. Starting to argue, the guy says he could do it his way but should remember something, because that place began without an explanation, leaving Jianwoo confused, asking what that meant. And at that moment, the man injects his syringe into him, telling the protagonist not to worry because it was just an elixir injection due to the limitations of his item, throwing the boy away, where he begins to freefall. Then while falling, Jianwoo thinks he was getting sleepy. Sometime later, a man asks the protagonist to wake up, and when he wakes up, he was in another body. The guy asks what would happen if he was knocked out by a monster, and Jianwoo remembers that person was Chunmin, asking if that was possession to experience Songjun's memories. Then Jianwoo asks him to wait because he would explode all at once. Observing that monster from the dungeon before, the boy thinks he thought that was a monster only from that dungeon. Equipping his dagger, he advances towards the creature. But at that moment, it disappears. Jianwoo is confused because he thought he had hit it. The guy asks if he had just realized that now because that monster was immune to physical attacks and abilities infused with magic, meaning its only weakness was the head, but the guy asks if he was kidding because that wouldn't help. Then the boy asks if he wanted to bet because there was always a truth in the standard approach. Then the man asks if he had any idea how he could reach the head, but Jianwoo just needed a rune. The guy mentions there were no more spaces for runes, but he informs that it wouldn't be him using the rune. However, the man says he was crazy, asking him to look at the defensive team. Seeing that battle, Jianwoo notices a child fighting a monster, and when the monster was about to attack him, the protagonist saves him. Asking if that was the boy with the flying rune, he confirms, asking if the protagonist wanted the rune. But Jianwoo says no, saying it was actually the boy who would take him there. He warns it was very difficult because he could run out of mana, but Jianwoo asks him to leave it halfway as he would take care of the rest. Facing that giant monster, the boy begins to move towards the creature. The little boy warns that was as far as he could go, so Jianwoo thanks him. Advancing towards the monster's head, the protagonist observes that giant stone. Using his dagger, he completely destroys it, and at that moment, the giant skeleton simply explodes. Jianwoo was happy because he was right when he said its weak point was the head. However, at the same time, he gets nervous because he realizes he was free-falling, taking an item from his inventory to cushion the fall. However, it still wasn't enough. Jianwoo gets desperate, asking if that would be his end. But the little boy appears, asking the protagonist to hold his hand, grabbing the boy where he ends up saving himself just in time. Then he thanks the boy, and before he even realized it, he was returning to reality. Opening his eyes, Jianwoo notices something, because he was still falling from the building. So he takes one of the items from his inventory, gaining a new ability, where he ends up gaining wings. In the sky, the protagonist is surprised because he had actually survived. But at the same moment, the system informs that his mana had run out so he couldn't use abilities anymore, crashing hard onto the ground. Looking to the side, Jianwoo notices that guy was still there. Trying to punch him, he ends up passing through, and the man mentions he had said that before, as that place had no explanation. But the boy questions if pushing someone off a building made sense, then the man says there was no need for that, but being called a thief had hurt him. Then the protagonist asks if he had a preferred name. So the man mentions he had always thought foreign names were cool, asking to be called Torino, asking if the boy had any doubts because he would extend 2 more questions just for him. Shortly after, Jianwoo asks if there was any way out of that place. The man mentions that soon boxes would fall from the sky, warning to find the box that had the key to escape the portal. Jianwoo thinks it was like a treasure hunt, asking if his wings would disappear after the elixir ended. But the man says no because that was a reward for the boy, and after the time ended, the wings would be stored in his inventory. Thinking about the next question, Jianwoo asks if contract items could be passed to another person. The guy is disappointed, thinking the boy would sell his dagger, answering that the decision was his, asking if that was his last question. Then the protagonist asks about any way to transfer set items, but the man didn't know anything about it. Jianwoo asks if he was trying to take the easy way out, but the guy mentions he only managed the hidden pieces. However, if the protagonist collected all the set items, who knows what could happen, leaving the boy confused about what that was. Then the guy says a designer could dissolve the soul contract with the items. Shortly after, Jianwoo asks if this designer could be Han Seojin. The man says maybe it could be, and if the boy was curious, he should collect the set items and find out for himself. Ending the questions, the guy says he would start. Then the system informs that the tutorial would begin, warning the protagonist to find the hidden key and escape from the dungeon. Then the boxes start falling from a plane, where Jianwoo uses his elixir to head towards the boxes. Our video ends here. If you liked it, leave your like. See you next time. Bye-bye.